Have you ever wondered what happens to a star after the spotlight fades? We often remember the legends, the ones whose names are etched into the marble of history. But what about the pioneers, the ones who carved the path, laid the foundation, and then, somehow, were forgotten by the very world they helped to build? Imagine a voice that echoed from the hallowed stage of the Grand Ole Opry, a Canadian trailblazer who brought the sound of the northern pines down to Nashville, only to have his own story become a whisper lost in the wind. This is the story of a man you've probably never heard of, but whose life was a dramatic, heartbreaking, and profoundly influential ballad of its own. This is the story of Hal Lone Pine. The story of Hal Lone Pine is a journey into the world of mid-20th century country music, a star who rose to prominence and then faded into oblivion. His real name was Harold Breau, born in 1916 in Pea Cove, Maine, though his family and career would become deeply rooted in Maine. Growing up in the hardships of the Great Depression, when radio was the only source of entertainment and hope, Harold was captivated by the authentic hillbilly music that emanated from far-flung stages like the Grand Ole Opry. Dreaming of escaping a life of manual labor, he taught himself guitar through radio and records. He created a romantic stage name for himself, Hal Lone Pine, and began a career at local radio stations, most notably CFCY in Canada, where he became a beloved figure. By the dawn of the 1940s, Hal Lone Pine was a force on the country music scene. He had risen from a dreamer in a logging town in Maine to become the region's most beloved musical figure. His warm baritone, beaming from the powerful CFCY radio station, was a fixture in thousands of homes across coastal Canada and New England. He had fans, a steady schedule, and a growing reputation. Despite his success, he was still a solo artist, and his performance lacked the kind of chemistry, the counterpoint that could elevate it from celebrity to legend. And then that fateful piece arrived, not in a new song, but in the form of a young woman named Betty Cody, against a backdrop of a world at war. Music was now more than entertainment. It was medicine, a bond of community. Rita, a French-American girl from Auburn, Maine, grew up in a family with a deep musical tradition. Her talent was a force of nature, a clear, powerful voice, and especially a superb yodel. It was not a gimmick, but an athletic performance of voice, a technical and emotional acrobatics that no one in the area could match. Their meeting became legendary. Picture the scene. In a crowded, smoky club in Maine, Hal, the star of the night, invites an audience member to the stage. Rita steps up, and when she opens her voice, the room falls silent. At first it is clear and powerful, but when she breaks into a yodel, it is like a bolt of lightning. Hal, a seasoned performer, immediately recognized that this was not just a good voice, but a true star, the one thing that had been missing from his career. He invited her to join the band immediately after the show, and she accepted without hesitation. Theirs was a perfect match. His voice was the solid ground. Hers was the brilliant lightning that flashed across the sky. Their working relationship quickly blossomed into love, and they married in 1940. Rita took the stage name Betty Cody, and they became a power couple on stage. The next decade was a relentless and arduous journey. Their life was a never-ending nomadic journey. The car became their mobile home, filled with instruments, costumes, and even small children born along the way. They faced bad roads, broken-down cars, and constant financial uncertainty. The story of their two young children being stranded in a car in a Canadian blizzard for 2 days illustrates this starkly. Amid the deadly cold and Betty's despair, Hal took out his guitar and sang to his children. Music was more than a career. It was a means of survival, something that held them together in the most dire of circumstances. Through it all, They honed their act to perfection, transforming themselves from a mere touring band into a much anticipated event. Their defining breakthrough came when they landed their own sponsored radio show, cementing their status as the kings and queens of the northern country scene. Though they had conquered their own world, their ambitions remained south. Their dreams of Nashville and the legendary Grand Ole Opry, which had been sparked by an old radio in Maine, were no longer a distant fantasy. Their reputation was big enough to catch the attention of the most powerful people in the music industry. By the late 1940s, the names Hal Lone Pine and Betty Cody had become synonymous with country music in the northern territories of America and Canada. They had spent a decade forging a career from scratch, their ambition fueled by gasoline and cheap coffee, their progress measured in worn-out tires and sold-out halls. Their sponsored radio show, out of Bangor, was a regional institution, a source of steady income and a direct line into the hearts of their loyal fan base. They had created a polished, captivating live act, a perfect blend of Hal's folksy charm and Betty's spectacular vocal firepower. They were the undisputed royalty of their regional scene, a big fish in a familiar pond. But the pond was starting to feel small. The faint, static-laced broadcasts from Nashville that had once seemed like transmissions from another planet were now sounding less like a distant dream and more like a destination. They had reached the ceiling of what they could achieve on their own. To break through to the next level, they would need a guide, a promoter with the connections and the clout to open the doors to the big time. That guide would turn out to be one of the most enigmatic and formidable figures in the history of American entertainment, a former carnival barker who called himself Colonel Tom Parker. At this point, Colonel Parker was not yet the legendary impresario who would steer the career of Elvis Presley. He was, however, already a major force in the country music world, a sharp, tireless, and notoriously shrewd promoter who managed the careers of stars like Eddie Arnold and Hank Snow. Parker had an uncanny eye for talent and an even better instinct for marketing. He heard about the sensation Hal and Betty were causing up north. Perhaps he heard one of their records on a regional station, or perhaps a fellow promoter tipped him off about the crowds they were drawing. Whatever the catalyst, Parker recognized their potential. He saw a ready-made, marketable package: the handsome classic cowboy singer, his beautiful wife with the killer yodel, and the appealing narrative of a hard-working musical family. Parker's involvement was a game changer. With his endorsement and his network, doors that had been firmly shut to a duo from Maine suddenly swung wide open. The most important of these was the door to RCA Victor. In the hierarchy of record labels, RCA was Mount Olympus. It was the home of the biggest stars, from the classical conductor Arturo Toscanini to the country superstar Eddie Arnold. To sign a contract with RCA Victor was to be anointed. It meant your records would be recorded in state-of-the-art studios, produced by the best in the business, and, most crucially, distributed and promoted all across the nation. For Hal and Betty, who had been making low-budget recordings for small regional labels, this was a monumental leap. Their sessions for RCA were a world away from the familiar studios of Bangor or Charlottetown. They were now working in New York City with seasoned session musicians, men who could lay down a perfect track in 1 or 2 takes. The pressure was immense, but Hal and Betty were professionals. They had been honing their craft for a decade and were more than ready for the challenge. The records they produced during this period captured the magic of their live act with a new level of polish and power. Hal's warm baritone sounded richer and more confident than ever on songs like the sentimental novelty hit It's a Boy, which celebrated the birth of a son. Betty's solo recordings were even more successful. Her powerful voice and astonishing yodeling were on full display in hits like Tom Tom Yodel. Together their duets, like the infectious On and On and On, showcased their perfect natural harmony. These RCA records were a success, climbing the national country charts and making Hal Lone Pine and Betty Cody known to a massive new audience, far beyond the reach of their old radio signal. With hit records now under their belts, the next logical step was to join the cast of one of the major national barn dance shows. While the Grand Ole Opry was the ultimate goal, a crucial stepping stone on the path to Nashville was the WWVA Jamboree in Wheeling, West Virginia. Broadcast every Saturday night from the beautiful Victoria Theater. The Jamboree, often called the world's original radio jamboree, was second only to the Opry in prestige. It was a beloved American institution, and its cast was a collection of country music's brightest stars. In 1952, Hal and Betty received the invitation to become official members. The move to Wheeling was another major upheaval for the family, which now included 4 young sons, Hal Jr., Richard, Dennis, and the youngest, Leonard, who was still just a boy. But it was a move they had to make. It signified their arrival in the major leagues. Life in Wheeling was a new kind of whirlwind. Instead of the constant travel of their previous life, their weeks were now anchored by the Saturday night broadcast. The Jamboree was a live, high-pressure, and exhilarating show. The Victoria Theater would be packed to the rafters with over 1,000 screaming fans, and the air backstage would be electric with the nervous energy of the performers. Here, Hal and Betty were no longer the biggest stars in the room. They were sharing the stage and competing for the spotlight with other giants of the genre, like Hawkshaw Hawkins, Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper, and Big Slim the Lone Cowboy. It was an intense competitive environment, but it was also a fraternity. They were all part of the same strange traveling circus, and they forged friendships and rivalries that would last a lifetime. Hal and Betty quickly became audience favorites at the Jamboree. Their polished professional act, honed over years of one-night stands, stood out. Hal was the consummate showman, and Betty's yodeling was a guaranteed showstopper. They were living the life they had dreamed of, a stable, high-profile gig on one of the most famous stages in the country. Their records were selling. Their name was known from coast to coast, and they were earning a good living. For a time, it must have seemed like they had finally found a home, but the dream of Nashville, of the Opry, still beckoned. The Jamboree was the big leagues, but the Opry was the World Series. Then, the opportunities they had been waiting for began to arrive. With hit records on a major label and stardom on the WWVA Jamboree, they finally caught the attention of Nashville. They received invitations for guest performances at the Grand Ole Opry, the most sacred stage in country music. It's hard to overstate the significance of this moment. In the world of country music in the 1950s, the Opry was everything. It was the highest honor, the ultimate validation of a career. To be invited to join its cast was to be welcomed into the inner sanctum, to have your name added to a sacred roster that included the founding fathers of the genre. For Hal Lone Pine, the boy from Maine who had idolized Opry stars on his radio, and for Betty Cody, the girl from the shoe factory town with the voice of an angel, this was the culmination of it all. Every mile driven, every shabby motel room, every meal eaten on the run, every doubt and every struggle, it had all led to this. Performing on the stage of the Ryman Auditorium as guest stars was the highest honor of their careers. The Ryman wasn't just a theater, it was a sanctuary, the mother church of country music. You could feel the history in its long, curved wooden pews, in the worn floorboards of the stage where Hank Williams had wept while singing "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry." Backstage was a chaotic, thrilling scene, a jumble of stars in their glittering, nudie suits, musicians tuning their instruments, and the ever-present WSM radio announcers preparing to take the show live to the nation. When Hal Lone Pine and Betty Cody stepped into the simple circle of wood at the center of the stage, the spot worn smooth by the boots of their heroes, they had truly arrived. They sang their hearts out, and the notoriously tough Nashville audience, the most knowledgeable country music fans in the world, embraced them. Their northern sound, their professionalism, and their undeniable talent earned them their place. While they likely never moved permanently to Nashville, their work frequently brought them into the heart of Music City. They recorded there and shared the stage with the very legends they had once idolized. They had reached the national spotlight, a dream fulfilled. For the first time in their married lives, they were now part of the Nashville elite, living and working alongside the very legends they had once idolized. They would see people like Ernest Tubb or Roy Acuff at the grocery store. They were part of the fabric of Music City. On stage, they perfected the image that had become their trademark, the wholesome, happy musical family. Hal, the steady and smiling patriarch, Betty, the beautiful and talented mother, and their 4 handsome sons. It was a picture-perfect image, a country music version of the American dream. And the centerpiece of this family portrait was becoming their youngest son, Lenny. From a very early age, it was clear that Lenny was not just musically inclined. He was a prodigy of staggering, almost frightening talent. Hal had put a guitar in his hands as a young child, and Lenny took to it with an obsessive, preternatural intuition. While his brothers were outside playing, Lenny would be inside, his small frame hunched over his guitar, his fingers flying across the fretboard, perfectly replicating the complex licks he heard on the radio or on his parents' records. He wasn't just copying, he was absorbing, deconstructing, and then reassembling the music with a sophistication that was decades beyond his years. Hal, recognizing his son's incredible gift and its commercial potential, began to incorporate him into the act. At first it was a novelty. The crowd would go wild for little Lenny, this tiny, serious-looking boy who could play the guitar with the speed and dexterity of a seasoned Nashville pro. Dressed in a little cowboy suit, he would step up to the microphone and peel off a note-perfect rendition of a Chet Atkins tune that would leave the audience and the veteran musicians backstage shaking their heads in disbelief. He became their secret weapon, their ultimate showstopper. The family act was now a sensation. But behind the glowing spotlight, the perfect family image was beginning to fracture under the weight of immense, unspoken pressures. The life of an Opry star was not just the Saturday night show. It was a grueling schedule of touring, performing on package shows that would travel the country for weeks at a time. They were back on the road, only now the stakes were higher, the schedule more demanding. For young Lenny, this life was a paradox. He was being celebrated for his genius, but he was also a child laborer, working a full-time job as a professional musician before he had even reached his teens. He was missing out on a normal childhood, on school, on friends, on the simple freedom of being a kid. The stage was his school, and the audience's applause was his validation. This created a deep-seated need for approval that would follow him for the rest of his life. At the same time, the internal dynamics of the group were growing more complex. Betty Cody was a superstar in her own right. Her solo records were often bigger hits than Hal's or their duets. She was a major talent, yet she was still billed as part of her husband's act. In the patriarchal culture of 1950s Nashville, he was the band leader, the man whose name was on the marquee. This undoubtedly created a quiet, simmering tension. Furthermore, Hal's own son was now regularly outshining him on stage. Hal was a fine, serviceable guitar player in the classic country rhythm style, but his son was a virtuoso, a budding genius whose musical interests were already expanding beyond the simple three-chord structures of country music into the complex harmonies of jazz. Hal was immensely proud, but some accounts suggest a man who was also bewildered and perhaps even intimidated by the sheer scale of a talent that had sprung from his own lineage, but was now rocketing into a stratosphere he could never reach. They had reached the summit. They were living the dream that had driven them for nearly 2 decades. They had a home in Nashville, hit records, a spot on the Grand Ole Opry, and a family of talented musicians. From the outside, the view was breathtaking, but from the inside, standing on that high, windy peak, the first signs of dangerous foundational cracks were beginning to appear, threatening to bring the entire beautiful structure tumbling down. Standing atop the mountain of fame often offers breathtaking vistas, but it's also fraught with danger and no shelter. In the mid-1950s, the musical family of Hal Lone Pine and Betty Cody stood at the pinnacle of the country music world. As members of the Grand Ole Opry, their Saturday nights were spent under the warm, hallowed lights of the Reman. Their voices beamed across the nation, but everyday life was a different story. The reality of Nashville's stardom wasn't one of static fame, but of a life in constant motion, a whirlwind of freeways and hotel rooms that made the hard years of earlier years seem like a leisurely vacation. The Nashville music machine demanded a constant presence. Hal's family was constantly booked on package tours, grueling cross-country expeditions on buses packed with Opry stars, performing night after night in a new city. For Hal, the pressure was immense and came from many sides. He was not just a singer, but also the head of a family business, a music manager, a father to 4 sons on the road, and the husband of a star whose personal fame sometimes eclipsed his. The image of a happy, wholesome musical family they projected on stage was a masterpiece of performance art. Behind the curtain, a darker picture was emerging. A marriage that had begun as the harmony of 2 ambitious dreamers was now buckling under pressure. The strain stemmed from their own success. Betty's solo hits were more commercially successful, and her son Lenny was no longer a cute act, but a musical phenomenon who easily stole the spotlight with his prodigious guitar talent. For Hal, who had built his entire career on being a leader, being constantly overshadowed by his wife and son was a challenging experience. According to Betty's account years later, this professional jealousy turned into family conflicts, with Hal becoming increasingly controlling and temperamental. The man who sang sweet songs of love on stage became a terror in his own home. At the same time, the musical bond between Hal and his genius son was also broken. Lenny became increasingly immersed in the complex world of jazz, a musical language his traditionalist father could neither understand nor accept. By 1957, the pressure cooker had exploded. All the personal pain and professional dissatisfaction could no longer be contained. Hal and Betty's marriage dissolved into a bitter divorce, ending one of the most successful family bands ever. But the most shocking development was yet to come. Betty Cody, a woman at the absolute peak of her career, made the unthinkable decision. She walked away from it all. She canceled her contract with RCA Victor, renounced her membership in the Opry, and turned her back on the fame she had spent her life building. It was an act of personal rebellion and a mother's sacrifice. She decided that the price of show business was too high, and she wanted to give her children a normal, stable life. Betty took her children out of Nashville and returned home to Maine. The transition was abrupt from the prestigious Ryman stage to a job as a shoe factory worker, trading the spotlight for peace. The breakup sent the remaining members on completely different paths. Hal's national career collapsed as the core of the band was lost, and the teenage Lenny, though musically free, suffered a deep emotional trauma that laid the foundation for his future struggles. The band was broken, the family was broken, and the spotlight was now a memory. A great fire, once it has consumed itself, does not simply vanish. It leaves behind a changed landscape of cooling embers, darkened earth, and the lingering scent of smoke. The brilliant, fiery spectacle of the Hal Lone Pine family act, which had burned so brightly on the national stage, was extinguished by 1957. What was left was the aftermath, 3 core individuals sent scattering like sparks from a dying flame, each set on a new, solitary trajectory, forever shaped and scarred by the heat of their shared history. Their stories from this point on are no longer a harmony, but 3 distinct, poignant melodies of survival, memory, and consequence. Hal Lone Pine, the man whose name had been on the marquee, found himself a king in exile. The kingdom of Nashville, with its intricate politics and insatiable appetite for the next new thing, had little room for a star whose act had been so fundamentally broken. Without Betty's voice and Lenny's guitar, he was a solo act once more, just as he had been in the beginning. But he was no longer the hungry, ambitious young man who had set out to conquer the world. He was a veteran, a man who had reached the summit only to lose his footing. He did what so many performers in his position do. He went home. He retreated from the national spotlight and returned to the familiar, welcoming territories of New England and the Canadian Maritimes, the places where his legend had been born. His later career was not a story of failure, but one of adaptation and resilience. In Canada, he was not a forgotten footnote. He was a revered elder statesman of country music. He settled in the Maritimes and continued to be a significant presence on the scene throughout the 1960s and into the 70s. He recorded for Canadian labels like Arc Records, releasing albums that were solid, professional, and warmly received by his loyal regional fan base. He became a fixture on radio and television, hosting programs like the Hal Lone Pine Show, where his easygoing charm and deep knowledge of the music made him a beloved personality. He was, in a sense, back where he started, a big fish in a familiar pond. But the pond was now a sanctuary rather than a stepping stone. He toured the circuits he knew so well, playing to appreciative crowds in community halls and small theaters, men and women who remembered him from his glory days and who still loved his honest, heartfelt style of country music. He remarried and lived a life far removed from the pressures of Music City. It was a quieter fame, a gentler career, but it was one that sustained him. He was, until the very end, a working musician. Hal Lone Pine died in 1977 at the age of 60. His passing was mourned in the Canadian music community, but it barely registered in Nashville. The world he had helped to build had moved on, and his name had faded from its memory. His legacy became a quiet one, a ghost in the machine of country music history. He was the Canadian pioneer who had walked the hallowed boards of the Ryman, a fact largely forgotten. He was the man who had given his prodigy son his start, a role completely overshadowed by that son's blinding genius and tragic end. Hal's story serves as a powerful testament to the ephemeral nature of fame. He had achieved the dream, but the dream was fleeting, and the price of its pursuit was a wreckage from which his reputation never fully recovered. While Hal found a measure of peace by returning to the stage, Betty Cody found hers by leaving it entirely. Her flight from Nashville was an act of profound self-preservation. She traded the glittering prison of celebrity for the anonymous freedom of a normal life. In Auburn, Maine, she was no longer Betty Cody, the Opry star. She was Rita Breau, a single mother of 4 boys, working grueling shifts at the Hill Mill Shoe Factory to put food on the table. The contrast is staggering and speaks volumes about her character. She possessed the strength to walk away from a world that most people would give anything to enter, all for the sake of her children. She chose the quiet dignity of hard labor over the hollow glamour of a life that had become, for her, unbearable. For years, she lived in near-total obscurity. The music world moved on, and the name Betty Cody was relegated to the "Where Are They Now?" files, but her talent was too great to be forgotten entirely. In the late 1970s, after her children were grown, she was coaxed out of her long retirement. She made a handful of recordings and live appearances, and her voice, though seasoned with age, had lost none of its power and purity. The state of Maine celebrated its forgotten superstar, inducting her into the Maine Country Music Hall of Fame in 1979. It was a moment of local recognition for a talent that had once captivated a nation. In her later years, Betty finally felt free to tell her side of the story. In candid interviews, she spoke of the hardships of the road, the complexities of her marriage to Hal, and the painful reasons for her departure from the music business. Her recollections were not bitter, but they were unflinching. She painted a portrait of a difficult, controlling man, a marriage that had buckled under pressure, and a world that was far less wholesome than the songs it produced. In doing so, she was not seeking pity or revenge. She was reclaiming her own narrative, giving voice to the silent struggles that lay behind the smiling photographs. She was a survivor, a woman of immense talent and even greater resilience, who had walked through the fire of fame and emerged on the other side, whole and on her own terms. Of all the embers scattered from the family fire, none burned with such a blinding, tragic incandescence as Lenny Breau. Freed from his father's musical control, the teenage Lenny was unleashed upon the world, a guitarist of celestial ability, but one who was woefully unprepared for life. He was a musical genius with the emotional vulnerabilities of a child raised in a storm. His story is one of breathtaking artistic achievement set against a backdrop of heartbreaking personal struggle. He completely abandoned commercial country music, diving headfirst into the deep, complex waters of jazz and fusion. He developed a revolutionary guitar style, blending fingerstyle country, flamenco, classical, and jazz into a seamless, fluid voice that was entirely his own. Using a custom-made 7-string guitar, he could play bass lines, chords, and melody simultaneously, sounding not like one guitarist, but like 3. He became a legend among musicians, a guitar player's guitar player, revered by giants like Chet Atkins, who famously called him the greatest guitarist in the world, George Benson, and countless others who were simply baffled by his talent. He made a series of brilliant, innovative albums that are still studied and treasured by musicians today. But his artistic brilliance was forever shadowed by the ghosts of his past. The trauma of his parents' divorce and his unnatural childhood left him with a crippling insecurity and a deep-seated addiction to drugs and alcohol that he would battle for his entire life. His career was a frustrating cycle of brilliant performances and squandered opportunities, of artistic peaks and desperate personal lows. The pain that fueled the blues in his music was devastatingly real. In August of 1984, Lenny Breau's tragic story reached its final, horrifying chapter. He was found dead in the swimming pool of his Los Angeles apartment complex. He was 43 years old. The coroner ruled his death a homicide by strangulation. The case was never solved, and his killer was never brought to justice, adding a layer of dark, unresolved mystery to his legend. Lenny's life was the most profound and lasting consequence of the Hal Lone Pine family story, a genius forged in its fire and ultimately consumed by its unresolved pain. So what, in the end, is the legacy of Hal Lone Pine? It is not a simple story of a forgotten star. It is a sprawling, multi-generational saga about the true cost of a dream. Hal was the pioneer, the ambitious dreamer who flew too close to the sun. Betty was the brilliant star who had the courage to choose a different sky. Lenny was the Icarus-like genius, whose magnificent flight and tragic fall were the direct result of the world his parents had created. To remember Hal Lone Pine is to remember the complexity behind every simple country song. It's to understand that families are complicated, that fame is a fickle and often cruel master, and that a legacy is not just measured in hit records or sold-out crowds. It is measured in the lives we shape, in the doors we open, in the love we share, and in the wounds we inflict. The story of Harold Breau is a profoundly human one, a tale of a man who reached for the stars, held them in his hands for a fleeting moment, and in the process created a constellation of talent, beauty, and sorrow that continues to echo, faintly but unmistakably, through the long, quiet corridors of musical history.